December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor struck the young men of America with the force of an earthquake. The abstract notion of foreign war became a terrifying personal reality overnight. For Wayne Blickenstaff, a shy, introverted high school graduate from Chino, California, the shock was immediate. The radio announcement he heard driving home that day was an irreversible catalyst for action. He had harbored a hazy premonition of conflict before, but the bombing now propelled him and his entire generation to enlist. It severed his roots in a relatively carefree life. That life had been defined by comic strips and simple dreams of adventure. The Army Air Corps was desperate to fill its ranks. It offered an immediate path to service, bypassing the traditional college requirements that Blickenstaff lacked. He competed against thousands of others in written examinations. He qualified for flight school by the narrowest of margins. This was a pivotal moment that set his life's trajectory. When he saw his cadet photo later, he was shocked by his own youth. They were just boys, barely old enough to vote. Yet they were being sent to fight a global war. His mother offered him the necessary support, despite her profound worry. He recognized her parental sacrifice fully. His journey began with a sensory assault. A train trip was marked by the rhythmic chuff of steam and rails. It carried enlistees who exhibited a mixture of bravado and palpable fear. It was on this journey that he met Marvin Bledsoe. Bledsoe was an experienced civilian pilot. His initial disqualification due to an overbite had been overcome by patriotic fervor. Pragmatic and outspoken, Bledsoe offered an early, cynical insight into the Army's organized nature. Blickenstaff recalled the nervous energy and alcohol that permeated the comfortable sleeper cars and dining hall. They felt less like soldiers and more like Boy Scouts without a scoutmaster. The illusion of comfort vanished quickly upon arrival at Williams Field. This was a hastily established staging area near Phoenix. After a dusty, extended ride, recruits were immediately subjected to a brutal, dehumanizing processing. Individuality was stripped away by rapid, almost violent haircuts. Physical examinations reduced the men to mere body parts. The barracks sergeant, Osterson, instilled immediate terror. He was a small man, with an imposing presence, a rasping voice, and an ape-like brow. Osterson declared bluntly that the recruits were nothing. He added that he did not care if he never saw them again. This initial cruelty was followed by a demoralizing venereal disease film. They also endured a lecture on celibacy. The chaos was often punctuated by the confusion caused by inexperienced trainers. The transition to Thunderbird Field promised real training. What it delivered instead was intense psychological torment and hazing. The base, with its earth-toned stucco set against the desert landscape, was a visual contrast to Williams. Yet, the schedule was relentlessly demanding. It started at 5 o'clock formation and continued until taps. There was no time for rest or study. Upperclassmen, led by Cadet Captain Sangar, warned the new arrivals. They told the recruits they would soon wish they were forfers. The hazing was systematic and brutal. It was designed to break the men down and enforce absolute obedience. Clyde Bressler became a prime example during the infamous brace incident. He was forced into a rigid, excruciating posture under a torrent of verbal abuse and jeering. This was a stark illustration of the psychological pressure intended to prepare them for the extreme demands of aerial combat. Despite the brutality, this environment paradoxically forged resilience. It created a tight-knit camaraderie among the cadets. Constant penalties, known as gigs, were given for infractions as minor as a loose button. This made academic focus difficult. Blickenstaff found ground school classes punitive. He struggled particularly with numerical calculations, though he grasped visual concepts easily. The ultimate threat, the fear of washing out, drove every cadet forward. A turning point arrived, with the introduction to actual flight training. They flew the rugged, dependable PT-17 Stearman primary trainers. Civilian instructor William Handel stressed that flying was about control, not instinct. He insisted that judgment was paramount. Handel simulated engine failures by cutting the throttle unexpectedly. This forced cadets to react instantly to the reality that aircraft were machines that could fail. Communication with the instructor was a struggle. It required shouting into a mouthpiece through stethoscope-like tubes, which taxed the throat. The flight line became a relative haven. It offered a relaxed atmosphere where Blickenstaff could concentrate solely on flying. This was a stark contrast to the hardline discipline of the barracks. He neared 9 hours, the threshold for being labeled a dodo, before his first solo. The experience was a profound personal transformation. His initial nervousness was marked by butterflies on a rampage, dry hands, and throbbing temples. But the fear dissolved into an overwhelming sense of freedom and mastery. He felt one with the aircraft, soaring through the sky. Yet the triumph was short-lived. Tragedy struck when Cadet Gerald Joseph Bridges was killed in a landing accident. He likely got foot-heavy on the brakes and flipped his PT-17. Authority figures announced the death, emphasizing the necessity of learning from mistakes. They commanded the cadets to carry on regardless. It was a chilling reminder of the precariousness of life in aviation. Meanwhile, the psychological pressure fostered defiance among the lower class. They plotted to overthrow tradition by winning the customary tug-of-war against the upperclassmen. On the day of the battle, Blickenstaff was intercepted attempting to reach the field. An upperclassman ordered him to perform a humiliating duck walk across the field. Thando was forced to flap his elbows and quack loudly. Driven by a deep sense of honor, he persevered through the agony and embarrassment. The tug-of-war itself was a brutal, muddy battle for supremacy. The determined lower class relied on unity and stocky muscle. They surprised everyone by pulling the upperclassmen through the mud moat and winning. It was a significant triumph of boldness over established hierarchy. The training continued to accelerate, moving to Minter Field. Here, Blickenstaff's anxiety flared during check rides. He began to over-control the aircraft, turning flights into a battle of wills. He nearly stalled his plane under the watchful, critical eye of Lieutenant Jackson. The critical breakthrough came unexpectedly. Lieutenant Walter Hunt, a frustrated instructor yearning for combat, took a scary gamble. He left Blickenstaff alone in the cockpit at an auxiliary field. This forced the cadet to rely entirely on his own abilities. His unconventional approach, coupled with Hunt's risky maneuvers in the demanding multi-vibrator aircraft, ultimately fostered confidence. But tragedy followed Blickenstaff yet again. Lieutenant Hunt died shortly after in a mid-air collision. Despite the somber shadow cast by this loss, Blickenstaff's final solo flight at Minter was a triumph of self-mastery. It was marked by the singing of the wind and the roar of the engine for company. The final crucible was Luke Field. Cadets immediately described it as the worst, meanest, gorderfulest, most chicken-shit field in the whole country. It was built on 1440 barren acres. The location was characterized by shimmering heat waves, dusty whirlwinds, and unrelenting 120-degree temperatures. First Lieutenant Franklin, gruff and officious, immediately vowed to transform the new arrivals from slobs into officers. The harshness was incessant, driven by Franklin's vindictive nature and his own insecurity. He felt judged by his superiors based on the number of cadets he disciplined. Blickenstaff endured an abusive check ride under Franklin in the North American AT-6. He feared constantly that he would be washed out, but had been finally soloed by the more encouraging Lieutenant Qualine. Qualine suspected that Franklin was actually too frightened to fly with him. After logging 82 hours at Luke, the grueling journey culminated in the graduation ceremony. He had accumulated 225.3 total flight hours. The ceremony took place on August 27, 1942. The awarding of the coveted wings symbolized their transformation into capable aviators. Blickenstaff and his friends were then assigned to the 91st Fighter Squadron at Hamilton Field. This assignment offered a pleasant respite from the desert heat. The harsh training at Luke had served its purpose, however. It had forged resilience, discipline, and a quiet determination. This preparation was essential for the grim realities of combat that lay ahead. The newly winged pilots, freshly transformed from cadets into second lieutenants, expected immediate deployment. They anticipated being hurled into the fray, perhaps against the Japanese in the Pacific or the Germans in North Africa. Instead, they encountered the soul-crushing inertia of military bureaucracy. Their initial assignment at Hamilton Field was a brief, pleasant interlude. This piece was quickly shattered by the ceaseless shuffling of orders. Orders flew around in a confusing and frustrating sequence. From Hamilton, they were routed to Mitchell Field. Then they went to the Philadelphia Air Defense Wing. They finally ended up in Baltimore. This dizzying deployment process was defined by the pervasive hurry-up-and-wait mentality. It left the men feeling less like warriors and more like parcels in a poorly run mail system. The assignment to the 353rd Fighter Group at Baltimore Municipal Airport delivered a crushing disappointment. They would be flying the P-40 Warhawk, not the anticipated P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-40, though famously flown by the Flying Tigers, was noisy, sputtering, and heavy. It was said to dive and climb like a rock. Its narrow landing gear made ground handling difficult. The environment at Baltimore was equally grim. The airfield jutted precariously into the Chesapeake Bay. Its runway was a hazardous strip, overshadowed by a massive slag pile and a looming crane that made every takeoff and landing a precarious flirtation with the water. Living conditions were stark. They lived in narrow, tar-papered one-story barracks with open ablution areas. This was a far cry from the comfort they had glimpsed stateside. Amidst the chaos, they forged resilience. Marvin Bledsoe, Blickenstaff's friend, recounted a mid-air collision. He had clipped another aircraft's wingtip. He maintained his innocence and blamed a senior officer. This incident offered a glimpse into the necessary pragmatism required to survive in the service. The pilots also faced the anxiety of rumors. They heard of submarine sightings and strange lights off the coast. These reports underscored their proximity to the war. By early 1943, the arrival of heavy cold weather gear and the formidable P-47 Thunderbolts definitively signaled their destination. They were going to England. The P-47, nicknamed the Jug, was heavier than any fighter built previously. It was a brute of a machine. Technical representatives explained its terrifying flaw, which was called compressibility. This was a phenomenon at high speeds, where the controls became virtually immovable. They advised pilots to use trim tabs and avoid extremes. They also acknowledged early radio teething problems. The transition to this aircraft was immediately deadly. Pilots like Second Lieutenant Meyer Rothblatt and Roy J. Reigard perished in early high-speed dive crashes. These were chilling reminders that this was no trainer, and mistakes carried an absolute price. The journey overseas began on June 1, 1943. They travelled aboard the Queen Mary, which was crammed with nearly 16,000 passengers. Blickenstaff recalled being jammed like hogs on the way to slaughter. They were confined to the ship's pungent bowels. Disembarking at Gourock, Scotland, on June 6th, the landscape was startlingly beautiful. It was a deep greyed-down green countryside that appeared like a patchwork quilt. The immediate reality of war set in at Goxhill. Their initial quarters were stark cement bunkers under the constant nightly blackout. The psychological warfare began immediately with the chilling, personalised broadcasts from Axis Sally. She welcomed the 353rd to Goxhill. This proved the enemy knew exactly who they were and where they were stationed. Colonel Zemke's briefing for their first combat mission was devoid of glamour. It was a fighter sweep over the mainland coast. He emphasized vigilance with a stark warning. He told them to watch your ass. He said it was the plane you do not see that shoots you down. Blickenstaff's first combat mission on August 9, 1943, was the psychological threshold. Crossing into enemy territory felt like a definitive crossing the line. It was a point of no return. Flying at 25,000 feet, the visibility was excellent over the North Sea. The experience was defined by the profound fear of the unknown. The visible black puffs of flak they encountered were unnerving. Yet the primary terror was the unseen German fighter that might materialize from the sun or the clouds. A week later, the psychological stress intensified. Colonel Morris, the squadron leader, was lost during an escort mission to Elbeuf. The pilots barely knew the man. They described him as a mysterious, almost robotic figure. They openly questioned his competence and indecisiveness. They speculated his demise might have stemmed from hesitation in the air. Major Loren McCollum, an experienced and well-liked pilot with 38 missions, took command. This provided a much-needed surge of confidence. Blickenstaff soon faced his own crisis of courage. Following a patrol, he broke off pursuit of an enemy fighter that later confessed to the flight surgeon Doc that he had chickened out. This profound self-doubt over his mission purpose and personal bravery was met not with condemnation but with essential psychological counsel. Doc reassured Blickenstaff, emphasizing that protecting the bombers was his primary duty. They explained that his survival was, in fact, more valuable to the group than individual heroics. This conversation helped Blickenstaff process his fear. It reframed survival as a necessary act of commitment. Meanwhile, the P-47's strategic limitations were being addressed. Earlier attempts with impractical 200-gallon tanks had failed. These tanks caused drag and fuel issues at altitude. The new 75-gallon pressurized belly tanks successfully extended the fighter's operational range by over 100 miles. This small technological victory offered a massive strategic relief. It allowed the pilots to finally penetrate deep enough to meet their escort duties. They could now begin the long, harrowing fight for air superiority. The intense winter storms that frequently swept across England brought bomber operations to a grinding halt. This forced the 8th Air Force to develop aggressive new tactics. General Arnold's stark, uncompromising New Year's message galvanized the fighter groups. He told them to destroy the enemy air force wherever you find them, in air, on the ground, and in the factories. They were no longer merely escorts, they were hunters. This strategic shift led to the development of fighter-bomber tactics. They started with dive bombing. The initial mission to Saint-Omer, France, was remembered as a complete fiasco. However, it proved the concept's viability. This quickly evolved into low-altitude strafing missions. These were spearheaded by the formation known as Bill's Buzzboys. This unit, which included Blickenstaff, specialized in attacks involving 1,000-pound bombs. They achieved dramatic results against locomotives and enemy aircraft on the ground. However, the element of surprise quickly evaporated. The airfields they attacked soon became a terrifying wall of flak. At the heart of this aggressive period was Colonel Glenn Duncan. Duncan was the group executive officer who later became the commander, and he was a controversial figure whose personal drive and palpable hatred for the Nazis made him a magnet for excitement. He consistently pushed inland, seeking combat where others might retreat. This style was effective at finding and destroying the enemy. However, it was often criticized by pilots who felt he was reckless with their lives. His aggression often resulted in perilous fuel shortages. The P-47 possessed immense durability. This was demonstrated when Dewey's plane absorbed massive damage after a mid-air collision. Yet the aircraft remained challenging at high altitudes. It suffered from a mushy stick response near the stall. The P-47 struggled to keep pace with faster German fighters. Duncan's methods were effective, but they constantly stretched the pilots and their machines to the breaking point. The immense psychological toll of command and the brutal consequences of split-second decisions manifested in a shattering tragedy. Duncan, flying as Slybird, undertook the heroic task of guiding Lieutenant Ireland's crippled aircraft home across the vast icy green water. Ireland's plane had sustained critical damage, leaving him without instruments and malfunctioning controls. Duncan's voice, calm and steady over the radio, nursed the fighter across the channel. However, upon nearing the safety of the airfield, Ireland, relying on deep-seated habit, automatically engaged the flaps. Only one flap deployed. The sudden, asymmetric drag caused the P-47 to stall and flip over in a shocking, fatal crash. The crash was witnessed by Blickenstaff and others. Ireland died the following morning. Duncan was consumed by guilt. He was convinced that his failure to specifically warn Ireland about the flaps had caused the death. He withdrew into a self-imposed isolation and punishment. This revealed a deeply sensitive individual whose tremendous sense of responsibility ran counter to his aggressive reputation. The incident profoundly impacted Blickenstaff. It forced him to confront the immense, crushing weight of leadership and the irreversible nature of command decisions. Compounding the pressure was the constant influx of inadequately trained replacements. Marvin Bledsoe, returning from instructor duties stateside, recounted his frustration with the flawed U.S. pilot training system. He observed that quotas and paperwork often superseded adequate instruction. Bledsoe's impassioned description solidified the veterans' understanding. They realized they were not only fighting the enemy, they were now forced to divert precious time to on-the-job training for pilots whose fundamental skills were lacking. The lead-up to D-Day in early June 1944 transformed the operational tempo into a relentless, exhausting grind. Ground crews painted the distinctive invasion stripes on the aircraft on June 5th. The next day, the group flew its first mission at 3:00 a.m. under the cover of darkness and fog. This marked a dramatic escalation. The group flew 7 missions on D-Day. They flew 9 on June 7th. They flew 3 more complete unit missions on June 8th, Ardino 9. That was the day Duncan returned with his aircraft so severely damaged that he had to land using only trim tabs. Blickenstaff, now the squadron operations officer, was responsible for scheduling and leading missions. These missions often lasted 16 to 18 hours daily. Sustained, relentless operations after D-Day demonstrated the critical role of air power in supporting the ground invasion. The focus was on flak busting and the widespread disruption of German transportation networks. They successfully crippled enemy logistics, claiming dozens of locomotives, rail cars, and motor vehicles. But the cost was staggering. The constant attrition depleted experienced personnel. This was evidenced by the loss of pilots like Walsh, who was nearing the end of his tour. This underscored the relentless human cost of the campaign. The P-47, the faithful workhorse, could no longer penetrate deep enough into the shifting battle zones. The strategic imperative to extend air coverage as far as Berlin drove the final technological shift. This shift was the transition to the North American P-51 Mustang that, beginning in October 1944, the 353rd Fighter Group began converting. This signaled a strategic evolution that finally allowed the 8th Air Force to achieve the necessary deep penetration and maintain air superiority over the collapsing German front. The appearance of the German Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in the late autumn skies introduced a terrifying new technological threat. This forced Allied pilots to discard their established tactics. The Me-262 was impossibly fast. It rendered traditional pursuit useless. Blick and his comrades realized that direct engagement was often futile. Strategy had to shift entirely to ambushes. They targeted the jets during the vulnerable moments of takeoff, landing, or when they were low on fuel around their airfields. Blickenstaff's rise to command of the 350th Fighter Squadron was born not of ambition, but of sheer attrition. Following the devastating losses of the summer, particularly the catastrophic mission of June 12, where Major Dewey was lost, Blick was thrust into the role. He had to rebuild a unit stripped of its experienced core. He struggled constantly with the immense psychological strain. He admitted to the flight surgeon, Doc, that he was tired. He was nearing his 96th mission and wanted desperately to leave. Wrestled with the need to project a strong, decisive image for his depleted unit versus his own personal exhaustion. But Doc's counsel was firm. A strong, visible leader was paramount. This internal conflict was tested on November 27, 1944. The mission, initially planned as a strafing run against oil tanks near Berlin, turned into a massive air battle, vectored by ground control from the operational hub known as the Nut House. Blick's flight penetrated deep into Germany, encountered a formation of nearly 200 enemy aircraft swirling between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. It was a terrifying sight, like a gaggle of gnats. Blick, leading his element, found himself isolated. He was attacking 3 large enemy formations with only his wingman for support, utilizing the K-14 gunsight, which allowed him to precisely drag the crosshairs through the line of flight. He tore through the German ranks. In a single, intense engagement, he destroyed 4 FW-90s. This occurred even after oil splattered across his canopy, nearly obscuring his vision. His own P-51 sustained heavy damage. The oil lines and throttle linkage were shot up. This forced him to make a desperate landing at Denain/Prouvy in France with critically low oil pressure. His exceptional skill and bravery against overwhelming odds earned him Ace-in-a-Day status and the Silver Star. The success of late November was immediately followed by the nadir of the air war, as the German Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The defining factor was the weather. Severe overcast skies, fog and snow frequently caused mission aborts. This prevented crucial air support for the ground troops. It allowed German forces to advance 60 miles into Allied lines. The pilots, frustrated and psychologically strained by the constant waiting, felt helpless. They were locked in a war fought against nature itself, and missions were finally cleared. The conditions were terrifying. Takeoffs were conducted almost entirely on instruments in 0-0 visibility. On one mission, Blick was leading Seldom flight to Gießen. He navigated a desperate instrument takeoff into dense, drizzly clouds. A massive B-17, which looked like a whale in murky water, suddenly materialized inches from his wing. This was a near-catastrophic collision. Later, Blick and his co-pilot, Duke, faced another desperate race against a rapidly closing, mammoth wall of clouds. This occurred as they attempted to return from France. They had enjoyed a luxurious, surreal visit with his childhood friend, Colonel Galbraith. The two men had shared champagne and a 5-course meal at a former German rest camp. The return flight became a struggle for survival. They were flying at 0 altimeter readings over the channel. This was a terrifying test of nerve. They finally broke out of the clouds at a mere 1,500 feet. The immense psychological pressure of this period affected everyone. The port staff, whose crucial roles often went unacknowledged, suffered profound emotional weariness. Doc, the flight surgeon, confided in Blick. He expressed deep boredom and depression. Doc confessed that while he understood the necessity of his role, he felt underappreciated. He yearned to feel genuinely useful. He emphasized that the war's psychological toll extended far beyond the cockpit. Meanwhile, the relentless casualties continued. Colonel Glenn Duncan, the legendary aggressive leader, was shot down deep in Germany. His oil line had been severed. Before vanishing into the woods, he calmly announced his situation. He set his plane ablaze. Duncan defiantly stated, "Goodbye, fellas. I'll be back in 3 or 4 weeks." General Kettner issued a teletype acknowledging Duncan's loss. He praised the group's never-quitting ethos. His absence, however, underscored the pervasive randomness of fate. The razor-thin margin between victory and death was never more apparent than during Blick's engagement in March 1945. After achieving his first Me-262 victory in February, he was pursuing another jet during a deep penetration mission. The enemy jet easily outran him. Spotting an armed train below, he recognized the target instantly as a major mistake. It was a magnet for intense flak. Blick attacked anyway. A massive explosion directly beneath his plane heaved the P-51 upwards. Smoke filled the cockpit. He realized he was on fire. In a moment of pure, panicked instinct, he found himself halfway out of the plane. Then his training took over. He regained control. He discovered his engine was still running. A large hole was visible in his left wing near the wheel. The area appeared wet with hydraulic fluid. The decision was agonizing: bail out or attempt an unprecedented one-wheel landing in a P-51. This feat had never before been accomplished in that aircraft. The thought of jumping seemed scarier than the landing. After the tower confirmed his left wheel was still up, he committed to the precarious maneuver. This required constant, minute adjustments to keep the damaged left wing clear of the ground. It was like a bird landing on one leg. He successfully brought the plane down. It skidded slightly before coming to a stop just off the strip. This extraordinary feat demonstrated supreme pilot skill under duress. It was immediately followed by his promotion to lieutenant colonel. This was a definitive recognition of his experience and leadership. It cemented his legacy as a resilient commander, forged in the terrifying crucible of late-war aerial combat. The final stages of the European air war were characterized by a systematic dismantling of German infrastructure. The Allied air superiority had become absolute. The focus shifted almost entirely from high-altitude air-to-air combat to low-level strafing. This involved the methodical destruction of rail lines, transportation hubs and factory remnants. Blick, now a lieutenant colonel, continued to lead these perilous missions. The urgency of the war's end fueled an almost reckless operational tempo. He was exhausted, but driven by the need to see the tour through. By March 1945, the war had become a battle of attrition against the Earth itself. It was punctuated by terrifying brief encounters with the remaining, desperate Luftwaffe units and the impossibly fast Me-262 jets. Blick's own vulnerabilities were exposed during an escort mission over Berlin in March. Flying at 20,000 feet, his generator suddenly failed. Panic, raw and immediate, seized him. With his electrical systems dying, he faced an agonizing split-second decision. Should he attempt to limp back west with a failing system and risk being captured by the Germans? Should he head east toward the advancing Russian lines? He grimly deemed heading east the better option. He chose west, fighting down the intense fear of the generator failing entirely. This forced him to rely on dead reckoning and his own nerve. The true emotional cost of the war, however, was in the witnessing. During his last flights, Blick found himself unable to escape the images of civilian suffering on the ground. He was particularly affected by the children. This sight led to a profound, visceral empathy and moral questioning about the nature of his life's work. He realized the chaotic reality of dogfights and the relentless bombing bore little resemblance to the theoretical discussions of his training days. Blick finally completed his 96th combat mission. This arbitrary number marked the end of his tour. The transition from the high-stakes environment of Raiden back to the relative sanity of the States was jarring. He travelled home via a 4-engine transport, likely a C-54. He was crammed into the disorienting interior with its inward-facing bucket seats. He then endured an unpleasant troop train ride across the US. The psychological readjustment began in earnest in Atlantic City, and returning pilots underwent mandatory evaluations. They were housed in luxury hotels along the boardwalk. They enjoyed lavish amenities and buffet-style tables featuring eagles sculpted in ice. This was a surreal country club atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the grim realities they had just left. Here, Major Eric Schwartz, the psychologist, conducted unconventional interviews. He probed deeply into their personal lives and their feelings about returning to combat. This process revealed the deep-seated anxieties and emotional detachment that characterized so many veterans. They carried what was sometimes called the Aleutian stare. This 1,000-yard gaze was indicative of profound mental weariness. Blick admitted that he struggled with the mundane aspects of civilian life. He felt a desperate need to slow down. He found public appearances awkward. He suffered a disastrous attempt to speak at the Rotary Club. The intense focus of combat had left him unable to simply relax. He realized the pilots had been forced to become adults before their time. Now, they had to catch up on the formative years they had missed. The protective crust of a hardened and thoughtless mind that had allowed him to function in combat was slow to thaw. This was true even when greeted by the palpable relief of his mother and aunt. He confessed internally that the war had left a profound, permanent scar. A part of him would never grow back. News of the war's end arrived on May 7th. This was followed by VE Day on May 8th. These days brought a powerful mix of relief, exhaustion, and lingering trauma. Blick recounted a final long ride to see London. Only half the lights were on. This was a visual metaphor for a city slowly regaining its vitality, but still marked by the conflict. He took a peaceful sightseeing journey over the German countryside. He flew over the Rhine, Cologne, and Kassel. This was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the fear of flying over those same areas under fire. He continued to fly the required 4 hours a month for flight pay. The thought of his luck finally running out haunted him. This made him superstitious about his final flights in the P-47, which he viewed as safer. Long after the war had ended, Blickenstaff, the quiet warrior, finally allowed his story to be told. His memoir was compiled many years later. It served as a crucial written record. This record honored the immense personal sacrifices of his comrades who did not survive. He consistently challenged the simplistic, heroic narrative often applied to his generation. He argued specifically against the label "the greatest generation." "We were just plain normal kids from all over the States," he insisted. "We were just trying to grow up in our own backyards. But then we were attacked, and suddenly all normalcy was gone. We did what we had to do. We did what anyone would do. We simply fought back." His legacy was not defined solely by his AA status or his Silver Star Award. It was defined by his profound understanding. He knew the war had stripped away their innocence. It forced them to become hardened men, and they were men who might never fully recapture the hopes and dreams of their youth. His memoir, titled Ace in a Day, finally gave voice to these psychological burdens. It spoke of the sheer, improbable luck of survival. It detailed the enduring personal cost carried by an entire generation of young men. They had been thrust into devastating circumstances. In doing so, he ensured that the sacrifices of the quiet warrior would not be forgotten. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these critical stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.